Hi there, I'm Charlie, and welcome to episode 5 of 7 on my series on Nestor Makhno. This one is entitled Nestor Makhno at the Peak of Makhnovist Power in the year 1919. 1919! Hell of a year for everyone involved in this story. The Russian Civil War is now in full swing. The Russian Civil War is a wildly complicated series of events with people constantly changing sides and allegiances, but the takeaway to understand what comes next is that there are about 4 factions that will ping-pong off each other in their struggle to either remain independent of or reintegrate into the Russian Empire. The first, and perhaps most notorious, of these armies is the Bolshevik Red Army, formed by Trotsky, yes, pedant, war criminal, lousy tipper, Leon Trotsky, forms the Red Army, which is an upgrade from the previous Bolshevik military force, the Red Guard, which was in fact all volunteer and all true believers. The Red Army is different in that it uses a lot of old Tsarist officers as generals and has forced conscription. Forced conscription, bit of a redundancy, but means that someone can come up to your farm, say your son looks old enough to hold a rifle, and when you object, you can say, sorry, he's being conscripted. Guess what? You're a member of the Red Army now. So, Red Army, Bolsheviks. White Army, who we've talked about a little, are the remaining 1% backed monarchist faction, largely, of the old Russian Empire. They want to make the Russian Empire great again, with them as the primary stakeholders. They are not unified, really. There are a whole bunch of white armies, and royalists and monarchists, but they all fall under the general umbrella of white army, and they have the most czarist officials and want to rewind the clock 20 years, functionally. They as opposed to the Bolsheviks, who want state capitalism, they want a monarchy. Nothing bad ever happened under a monarchy, kids. The White Army in particular, as we will explore, has a vicious reputation for anti-Semitism as not just a regrettable thing that happens to happen, but as a recruiting tool. And the third is our guy's army, the Black Army, the anarcho-communist army based in Ukraine and based around the free territory of Makhnovia. They tend to be, in contrast to the Bolsheviks, who are largely urban workers, the rural farmers and former serfs or peasants of Russia. And they were not limited to Ukraine. There were some in Siberia, as a matter of fact. And the Tambov Rebellion is largely inspired by the Black Army. So, red, white, black, and to make it more confusing, you've got the Greens, baby! The Greens are numberless little peasant armies or militias that generally look out for themselves, but they might collaborate with the Reds against the White, or join up with the Black Army to punch the Reds in the nose. They're harder to quantify, but basically think peasant militias. Okay, so now that we've summarized the major armies in the Russian Civil War, we can talk about the horrors that armies bring with them. Remember, Russia had just gotten out of the First World War, so you have a disproportionate amount of men with military training who are willing to sign up for any one of these particular 4 causes. The anarchist historian Volin has a really great quote that I think is worth reading in full about the corrupting power of armies, even if you start with a good cause. Any army of whatever kind is an evil. Even in a free and popular army, composed of volunteers and dedicated to the defense of a noble cause, is by its very nature a danger. Once it becomes permanent, it inevitably detaches itself from the people and the world of labor. Its members lose the inclination and the ability to lead a healthy working life, with an imperceptible and therefore dangerous gradualness. It becomes a collection of idlers who acquire antisocial, authoritarian, and even dictatorial leanings, who acquire a taste for violence as a thing in and of itself, for the brute force in cases where recourse to such means is contrary to the very cause it purports to defend. Volin argues that having an army active in the field at all for any length of time is an evil. It will lead to a steady uptick in war crimes, just by its nature, no matter if you're fighting for the right of peasants to own their land and heroically be left alone by everyone else. A good example of this, and one of many of the human costs that come with Russian Civil War, is the Eichenfeld massacre in 1919, where a bunch of Makhnovist troops, Black Army troops, ride into the village, Mennonite village, of Eichenfeld, take everything that isn't nailed down, burn what they can't take, and execute 79 civilians. That doesn't sound like a lot of people, but I doubt I could name 79 people that I know personally. Worse was that the perpetrators of the Eichenfeld massacre were not prosecuted, and this was not remarkable, except for to the Mennonite community and the survivors of the massacre who fled the Ukraine. This sort of thing was happening every day by all of the sides, because they are made up of people, and people like to settle personal grudges or engage in bloodlust through the Russian Civil War. This is the sort of thing that Makhno assumed responsibility for by being a member of the anarcho-communist and their figurehead, really. Anyway, the good news is that the Austro-Hungarians, or OWT, out of Ukraine. They retreat after Brest-Litovsk and the Bolsheviks start pushing down, which means that Makhno is now in the wonderful position of sticking it to Trotsky. Trotsky, who, I can say without exaggeration, is a pedant, a war criminal, and a lousy tipper, is a very hateable guy. And he makes no effort to endear himself to Makhno, why should he, by conducting a raid on Hulie-Polye, Makhno's sort of home base of the Free Territory, and trying to ban the anarcho-communists from meeting as, this is an illegal meeting, how could you, this is not in keeping with Bolshevik practice. And Makhno's like, well, yes, of course not, we're not Bolsheviks, you don't get to tell us what to do, Dad. I mean, fair enough. Makhno has one of these wonderful talents for attracting remarkable people to him. Fedir Shus, why he might be a monster, is a remarkable person. Maria Nikiforova, though dead at this point, is a remarkable person. One of the more interesting people that Makhno attracts is his wife, Agafia Kuzmenko, who is a school teacher. In the same way that the Bolsheviks idolized, or in their literature, idolized the urban worker, the Makhnovists extolled the toilers, or the farmers, and school teachers, because they view them as working class, just trying to make a buck to get by in this crazy world. And it would lead to scenes like the Makhnovists bursting into a village, running into the one-room schoolhouse, saying, "Oh, you're a teacher, great! Can you write us a poem about how great Makhno is? You obviously must be on our side." because you're a working stiff like us. And this poor, terrified school teacher, these very hairy men with guns, like, yes, of course, I will do that immediately. Anyway, the takeaway from this is that the Makhnovists particularly esteemed teachers. Unlike the, I would argue, virulently anti-intellectual white and red armies, the Makhnovists would hold back if you were an education professional. Agafia Kuzmenko is one of these educational professionals, and she does not have any more chill than Makhno does. They meet and marry in the middle of the Russian Civil War, and Agafia Kuzmenko did not really take shit from anyone. She was recorded as several times being on the front line with Makhno, and kept the Makhnovist principle of, we don't have prisons, we enforce discipline in pretty much one way. Agafia Kuzmenko was very aware of the horrors of war, and when she saw people looting or raping, even if they were under her flag, she would just shoot them without comment. Makhno would do this sort of thing as well. So, not someone to mess with, very intense. If you look at photographs of her, you can just see there's something in her eyes that would bring her and Makhno, these two very intense people, together. She actually proves critical in solving one of Makhno's problems. Remember how I talked about there's a lot of bleed between the four armies? Well, eventually, and this is in no particular order, a Cossack ataman employed by the Red Army gets sick of taking orders from the Red Army and defects to the Black Army, this guy named Grigoriev. Grigoriev pals around with several hundred of his most heavily armed friends, and for about 3 weeks it looks like he's making a clean break. However, Makhno does some asking around and finds out that Grigoriev was not only responsible for, but actively encouraged pogroms of the Ukrainian Jewish population during his time in the Red Army. Grigoriev is asked to a meeting with Makhno and his senior staff, which includes Agafia Kuzmenko, and is publicly accused of his crimes, and then immediately shot, some sources say, by that same Agafia Kuzmenko, Makhno's wife. And this slugfest with Trotsky and the back and forth between the Red and Black armies comes to a brief halt. It comes to a brief halt because Anton Denikin, a White Army general who is virulently anti-Semitic even by those time standards, is enough of a threat that Trotsky and Makhno put their differences aside for the moment. Denikin, by the way, his recruiting slogan was, "Save Russia, beat the Jews." And I can just hear the PR department dying inside right now. He thought this was a great idea and tries to push north. Makhno and Trotsky eventually succeed in routing him after a bit of effort. And to the surprise of literally no one, Trotsky immediately betrays Makhno and tries to have him assassinated. It does not work, obviously. The two Cheka agents they sent were caught and brutally executed by Makhno's own counterintelligence service, which, while certainly no saints, were at least nominally better than the Cheka. So Makhno has reached the apex of his power in 1919. He has the free territory of Makhnovia, but there are a number of challenges to it. And he's back to fighting his old reliable enemy Trotsky. It is a chaos of massacres and confusion. There's a quote about the 30 Years' War, which the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War remind me of very clearly, about the hell it was for the working people and peasants. And the quote is as follows. Peasants had been so demoralized by the constant passage and repassage of armies across their lands that they did not bother to reap or sow, and the appearance of any army, no matter its colors, friend or foe, was catastrophic for them. One peasant is recorded as saying, "We have had blue coats and red coats, and now come the yellow coats. God have mercy on us." While this was said about the 30 Years' War, the sentiment and the reality on the ground definitely applies to the Russian Civil War, which is now coming to a crescendo, which we'll deal with in the next episode in 1920.